I stood at the edge of the trailhead, taking in the view of the Great Smoky Mountains that stretched out before me. The morning sun caught on the mist that gave the mountains their name, creating a dreamlike landscape that made my chest swell with excitement. After years of seasonal gigs at overcrowded national parks, I'd finally landed a permanent position in one of the most beautiful places in the country, my new home. The drive to the ranger station took me along winding roads that hugged the mountainside. I rolled down my window, breathing in the crisp mountain air filled with the scent of pine and wet earth. My truck handled the curves easily, and I couldn't help smiling as I spotted a group of deer grazing in a clearing. This was exactly what I'd been looking for: wilderness, solitude, purpose. The main ranger station was a sturdy log building with a green metal roof, nestled among tall pines at the base of the mountain. I parked in the spot marked "Staff Only" and grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat. My boots crunched on the gravel as I made my way to the entrance, straightening my new uniform shirt. I wanted to make a good impression. Inside, the station smelled like coffee and old wood. A few rangers looked up from their desks as I entered, nodding politely before returning to their work. A woman at the front desk pointed me toward a door marked Kenneth Haley, Head Ranger. I knocked twice and heard a gruff, "Come in." The office was small but neat, with maps covering most of the wall space and a large window overlooking the forest. The man behind the desk stood as I entered. He was in his mid-50s, with short salt and pepper hair and a deeply lined face that had clearly seen decades of sun. "Blake Wheeler?" he asked, extending a weathered hand. I nodded, shaking his hand firmly. "Yes, sir. Reporting for duty." "Kenneth Haley. I'll be your direct supervisor." His handshake was strong, his gray eyes sizing me up with an intensity that made me stand a little straighter. "You come with good recommendations. How was the drive-in?" "Beautiful. I couldn't have asked for better weather." Kenneth nodded, gesturing for me to take a seat while he returned to his chair. "You're assigned to the Eastern Ridge cabin. It's isolated, which is why we typically put our night shift rangers there. Less traffic, easier to monitor the area." "Night shift?" I asked. My application had mentioned flexible hours, but this was the first I'd heard about working nights specifically. "That's right. 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Problem with that?" His tone wasn't exactly challenging, but there was something in it that suggested the question wasn't just a formality. "No, sir. No problem at all." "Good." He opened a drawer and pulled out a ring of keys, a handheld radio, a flashlight, and what looked like a standard-issue Park Service pistol in its holster. He placed them on the desk between us. "Standard equipment. The pistol is mainly for wildlife encounters, though you shouldn't need it if you follow protocols." I nodded, collecting the items and securing the holster to my belt. Kenneth then pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "Your patrol routes, emergency contacts, and station protocols are all in here. Read them carefully." He paused, then pulled out a separate sheet of paper. "These are the night shift rules for the Eastern Ridge cabin. They're non-negotiable." I took the paper, expecting to see standard safety protocols, radio check-ins, emergency procedures, wildlife encounter guidelines. Instead, I found myself reading something very different. 1. Remain inside the cabin from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. 2. Ignore any unexplained noises outside the cabin. 3. If you see a woman in white who knocks 3 times, do not look at her or answer the door. 4. If a man in a park ranger uniform you don't recognize enters the cabin, leave immediately through the back door. Lock the door behind you and call me. 5. Check the phone line every 30 minutes throughout your shift. 6. Report any lights in the forest after midnight. I looked up from the paper, waiting for Kenneth to crack a smile or tell me this was some kind of joke. His expression remained serious, his gray eyes fixed on mine. "Is this some kind of initiation thing?" I asked with a nervous laugh. "Hazing the new guy?" Kenneth didn't smile. "These rules keep rangers safe. Follow them without exception." I glanced down at the paper again. "But what's this about a woman in white? And leaving if I see another ranger? I don't understand." "You don't need to understand," Kenneth cut me off. "You just need to follow the rules. The Eastern Ridge has specific challenges. These protocols address them." I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, still convinced this was an elaborate prank. Probably a tradition for new rangers, scare them with ghost stories on their first night. I'd played along with worse hazing rituals in previous jobs. "Yes, sir. I'll follow the protocols." Kenneth studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good. The cabin is stocked with supplies. Your shift starts tonight." I suggest you get settled in and rest before 9. He stood, signaling our meeting was over. As I turned to leave, he added, "Wheeler." I looked back. "I mean what I said. Those rules aren't suggestions. They're what keep you alive out there." The intensity in his voice made my smile fade. "Understood, sir." I spent the afternoon moving my belongings into the cabin, which was more comfortable than I'd expected. It had a small bedroom, a decent kitchen, a bathroom with a shower, and a main room that served as both living room and office. The front porch offered a stunning view of the forest and mountains beyond. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, going through the folder Kenneth had given me. The regular protocols were straightforward. Standard Park Service stuff about visitor management, wildlife encounters, and emergency procedures. But I kept coming back to that list of night shift rules, reading them over and over. What kind of joke was this? It had to be a prank. Maybe there was a hidden camera somewhere, recording my reactions for the amusement of the other rangers. The light faded, and I went inside to prepare for my first night shift. I made a simple dinner, checked my equipment, and set up the desk in the main room with my logbook and radio. At 8:55, I called the main station to check in as required by the standard protocols. "Eastern Ridge Cabin, checking in for night shift," I said when Kenneth answered. "Received. Remember your protocols, Wheeler, all of them." "Will do." I hung up, shaking my head with a smile. They were really committing to this joke. At 9 o'clock, I locked the doors as instructed and settled in for what I expected to be a quiet night of paperwork and occasional radio checks. The cabin creaked and settled as the temperature dropped outside and the wind whispered through the trees. Normal sounds, nothing to be concerned about. At 9:15, I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze, pen hovering over the logbook. The footsteps were light but distinct, definitely human, not an animal. They moved slowly across the wooden boards, stopping just in front of the door. My first thought was that it must be Kenneth or another ranger coming to check on me or continue the prank. I rose from my chair and moved toward the window beside the door, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out. What I saw made my blood run cold. A woman stood on the porch, her back to the door, facing out toward the forest. She wore a long white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her hair was black and hung down her back in a straight curtain. As if sensing my gaze, she slowly turned and walked to the door. Her face was pale, her features indistinct in the shadows. She raised her hand and knocked on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. Rule number 3 flashed in my mind. If you see a woman in white who knocks 3 times, do not look at her or answer the door. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. This was just part of the hazing, right? One of the female rangers dressed up to scare me. But how had Kenneth known she would knock exactly 3 times? I forced myself to turn away from the door, moving back to my desk. My hands were shaking as I picked up my pen, trying to focus on my paperwork. The rational part of my brain argued that this was just an elaborate prank, but something deeper, more instinctive, was screaming at me to follow the rules. Minutes passed like hours. I kept my eyes fixed on the logbook, though I couldn't focus enough to write anything. The cabin was completely silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity but was probably closer to 10 minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to look. If this was a prank, I'd catch them in the act and the joke would be over. I moved back to the window and carefully pulled the curtain aside. The porch was empty. I blinked, then looked again, more carefully this time. There was no sign of the woman in white, no footprints in the dirt beyond the porch steps, no movement in the trees. It was as if she had never been there at all. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the surrounding darkness. The beam cut through the night, illuminating trees and undergrowth, but no sign of anyone. The forest was silent except for the normal sounds of night creatures. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small in the vast darkness. No response. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind raced with explanations. She could have simply walked away quickly, or hidden in the trees, or circled around to the back of the cabin. All reasonable explanations. Yet none of them felt right. I glanced at my watch. 9:30. Time for the first phone check, according to rule number 5. The cabin had an old landline phone mounted on the wall in the kitchen. I picked up the receiver and listened. The dial tone hummed normally in my ear. Nothing unusual. I hung up, marking the check in my logbook with shaking hands. Every 30 minutes for the rest of the night, I repeated this process. 10 o'clock, 10:30, 11, 11:30. Each time the phone line was normal. Each time I marked it in my log. Each time I found myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see the woman in white staring back at me, but she never reappeared. I checked for lights in the forest after midnight, as Rule 6 instructed, but saw nothing unusual. Just darkness and stars and the occasional glow of fireflies. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I was exhausted and on edge. I'd spent the entire night jumping at every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside. When my watch finally showed 6 a.m., I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I gathered my things, locked the cabin, and drove back to the main station. The morning was beautiful, birds singing, mist rising from the valleys, the sun painting the mountains gold, but I barely noticed. My mind was still in that cabin, still seeing the woman in white, still hearing those 3 distinct knocks. Kenneth was already at his desk when I arrived. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "How was your first night?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure what to say. If this was all an elaborate prank, admitting I'd been scared would just give them the reaction they wanted. But the memory of the woman in white, of how she'd vanished without a trace, made me doubt my own skepticism. "I saw her," I finally said. "The woman in white. She knocked 3 times, just like you said she would." Kenneth nodded, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "Did you look at her or answer the door?" "No." "Well, I looked at first, but then I turned away like the rules said. When I checked again later, she was gone." "Good." He seemed satisfied. "The phone checks? All normal. No lights in the forest." "Good," he repeated. "You followed the protocols. That's why you're standing here now." A chill ran through me at his words. The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so serious, made it impossible to maintain my belief that this was just a joke. "Kenneth," I said, my voice lower now, "what's going on up there? Who was that woman?" He studied me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Get some rest, Wheeler. You did well for your first night. I'll see you back here at 8 tonight for your check-in call." I wanted to press him for answers, but the dismissal in his tone was clear. I nodded and turned to leave, my mind still racing with questions. As I drove back to my apartment in town, the morning sun bright on my face, I couldn't shake the feeling that those strange rules weren't just protocols. They were warnings. And whatever they were warning against was very, very real. I'd come to the Great Smoky Mountains excited about my new position, about the wilderness and solitude. Now, as I prepared to sleep before my second night shift, I found myself wondering exactly what I'd gotten myself into, and whether those bizarre rules might be the only thing keeping me alive in the darkness of the Eastern Ridge. I returned to the Eastern Ridge cabin for my second night shift, feeling a weird mix of dread and curiosity. The memory of the woman in white from the night before kept playing in my head as I settled in at the desk. I'd spent most of the day trying to sleep, but my mind kept going back to those 3 knocks and Kenneth's cryptic comment about why I was still alive. The cabin felt different tonight, like it was waiting for something. I shook off the thought and focused on my duties, checking the phone line at 9:30, 10, 10:30, and 11 as required. Each time the dial tone hummed normally in my ear. At 11:30, I picked up the kitchen phone again, listened for the steady dial tone, and marked it in my logbook. I had just set the receiver down when I heard it, a slow, unmistakable creak from the front of the cabin. The door was opening. I froze, my hand still on the phone. I hadn't heard footsteps on the porch or knocking, just the door swinging open on its hinges. A man stepped inside wearing a park ranger uniform. He looked about my age, maybe a bit older, with a standard-issue hat pulled low over his eyes. "Evening," he said casually, "just making rounds." My mind raced through the rules. Rule 4, if an unknown ranger enters, exit through the back door and call Kenneth. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys from the desk and snatched my phone from my pocket. Without saying a word to the man, I turned and bolted toward the back of the cabin. "Hey!" the ranger called after me, his voice suddenly sharp. "Where are you going?" I didn't answer. I reached the back door, yanked it open, and threw myself outside into the cool night air. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally finding the right one to lock the door from the outside. I backed away from the cabin, my breath coming in quick bursts as I pulled up Kenneth's number and hit call. The phone rang once before he answered. "Blake?" Kenneth's voice was alert, not sleepy at all. "There's someone in the cabin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "A ranger I don't know just walked in through the front door. Are you outside?" "Yes." I locked the back door behind me. "Good. Stay there. Don't go back inside. I'm on my way." Kenneth's tone left no room for questions. "Stay by your truck, away from the cabin. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The call ended, and I was alone in the dark. I made my way to my truck, parked about 30 yards from the cabin. The night was quiet except for the usual forest sounds, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. Nothing to suggest anything unusual was happening. From where I stood, I could see the cabin's windows glowing with the lights I'd left on inside. I strained to catch any movement, any shadow passing in front of the windows, but saw nothing. Whoever or whatever had entered seemed to be staying put. The minutes crawled by. I checked my watch every few seconds, the glow of its face the only thing keeping me company. After what felt like hours but was only about 18 minutes, headlights appeared on the access road. Kenneth's Park Service SUV pulled up next to my truck. He got out quickly, his face set in grim lines. He was carrying his service pistol. "Stay here," he said, not even looking at me as he walked past. I watched as Kenneth approached the cabin cautiously, gun drawn but pointed at the ground. He went up the front steps and tried the door. It opened easily. I realized I hadn't locked it in my rush to get out the back. Kenneth disappeared inside. The wait was excruciating. I kept my eyes fixed on the cabin, looking for any sign of what might be happening. There were no sounds of struggle, no shouts, nothing to indicate what Kenneth was doing in there. 5 minutes later, Kenneth emerged alone. He holstered his weapon and walked back to where I stood. "It's clear," he said. "You can go back in." I wanted to ask what happened to the ranger who'd entered. I wanted to know who he was, why he was there, why his presence had warranted such a response. But the stern set of Kenneth's jaw and the hard look in his eyes stopped the questions before they left my mouth. "Thank you," I said instead. Kenneth nodded. "You did the right thing. Remember that." We walked back to the cabin together, Kenneth slightly ahead of me. Inside, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. The logbook was still open on the desk. My coffee mug sat half empty beside it. There was no sign anyone else had been there at all. I looked around, confused. But he was right here, a ranger. He came in and said he was making rounds. "There are no rounds at night," Kenneth said flatly. "No one should be entering your cabin during your shift. No one." He did a quick walkthrough of the small cabin, checking each room before returning to the main area. "Continue your shift as normal," he said. "Call me if anything else happens." With that, he left, the door closing firmly behind him. I stood in the middle of the room listening to his vehicle start up and drive away. I checked every corner of the cabin, looking for any evidence of the intruder. There was nothing. No muddy footprints, no items out of place, no sign at all that anyone other than Kenneth and I had been there. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a routine. But the strange incidents didn't stop. The woman in white never returned, but other things happened. One night, during my 1:30 phone check, the line crackled with static when I picked it up. I was about to hang up and try again when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Distant, muffled by static but unmistakable, screaming, human screaming, high and desperate, coming through the phone line. I dropped the receiver like it had burned me. It dangled from its cord, the screaming still faintly audible. I grabbed my cell phone and called Kenneth. As always, he answered on the first ring. "The phone line," I said without preamble. "They're screaming." "Can you still hear it?" Kenneth asked, his voice calm. I picked up the landline receiver cautiously. The screaming continued, now punctuated by what sounded like sobbing. "Yes," I said. "Put the receiver down, but don't hang up," Kenneth instructed. "Continue monitoring the situation. I'll handle it from my end." "What do you mean, handle it?" I asked, my nerves frayed. "What is this? Who's screaming?" "Blake," Kenneth's voice was firm. "Put the receiver down and continue monitoring. That's an order." I did as I was told, placing the receiver on the desk, where I could still hear the awful sounds coming from it. I sat there, watching it, my skin crawling as the screams eventually faded into whimpers, then silence, then finally the normal dial tone returned. I called Kenneth back to report the change. "Good," he said. "Continue your phone checks as scheduled." The screaming happened twice more over the following weeks. Each time I called Kenneth, and each time he told me to monitor the situation. Each time the screams eventually stopped and the line returned to normal. I wanted to quit. I thought about it every morning as I drove back to town, exhausted and jumpy from another night of unexplained events. But something kept me coming back, a mix of curiosity, stubbornness, and the strange sense that I was part of something important, even if I didn't understand what it was. And through it all, Kenneth remained my lifeline, always answering on the first ring, always knowing what to do, never explaining, but somehow keeping me safe as long as I followed the rules. I spotted the lights on my 10th night. At first, I thought they were flashlights, maybe hikers who'd lost their way, but they moved wrong, too quick, too coordinated. It was 12:45 in the morning when I first noticed them through the cabin window. I'd been doing my usual checks, marking the logbook after confirming the phone line was working. When I looked up, I saw them, bright points of light deep in the trees, maybe a quarter mile from the cabin. I put down my pen and moved closer to the window. The lights danced between the trees, not in a straight line like someone walking, but in circles and zigzags. They'd move in one direction, stop suddenly, then shoot off in another. No hiker moved like that, no animal either. I counted 5 distinct lights. They glowed bluish-white, brighter than flashlights had any right to be at that distance. As I watched, they formed a perfect circle, held it for about 10 seconds, then broke apart and scattered in different directions before coming back together again. My first thought was to grab my phone and call Kenneth. I punched in his number with shaking fingers. "Blake?" Kenneth answered on the first ring, just like always. His voice sounded alert despite the hour. "I'm seeing lights in the forest," I said, keeping my eyes on the window. "Rule 6, right? They're moving in patterns, not like people walking. More like, I don't know, like they're dancing or something." "How many?" Kenneth asked sharply. 5, maybe 6 now. They're bright, bluish, moving in ways that don't make sense." "Listen carefully," Kenneth said. His voice had that edge I'd come to recognize, the one that meant this wasn't a drill. "Stay inside, lock everything, windows, doors, everything. And Blake, this is important. Don't look directly at the lights for more than a few seconds at a time. Understand?" "Yeah, don't look too long. Got it." I moved back from the window a bit. "Are you coming up?" "Not tonight, just follow my instructions. Call me if anything changes." The line went dead. I locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket, then made a quick circuit of the cabin, checking that every window was locked and every blind was drawn except for the one I was watching from. I didn't know what good locks would do against whatever was making those lights, but Kenneth's rules had kept me alive so far. I returned to the window and watched. The lights continued their strange choreography, sometimes separating widely, other times clustering so tightly they almost looked like a single, larger light. They never came closer to the cabin, staying deep among the trees. I tried to follow Kenneth's instruction about not looking too long, but it was hard to tear my eyes away. The patterns were almost hypnotic. After watching for maybe 15 minutes, I started to feel a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a headache. I forced myself to look away, count to 30, then look back. The lights continued their dance for nearly an hour. I checked my watch repeatedly, marking the time in the logbook as if this were just another routine observation. At 1:43, all 5 lights froze in place, hung motionless for maybe 10 seconds, then winked out simultaneously. One moment they were there, the next, complete darkness. I kept watching for another half hour, but they didn't return. The forest looked normal again, just dark trees and the occasional glimmer of starlight through the branches. I completed my shift in a state of hyper-alertness, jumping at every creak of the cabin settling. Kenneth never showed up. When morning came, I called him as soon as my shift ended. "The lights disappeared around 1:45, I told him. "They just stopped and vanished all at once." "Good," Kenneth said. "Everything's been handled." "Handled? What does that mean? What were those lights?" "Just keep following the rules, Blake. That's all you need to worry about." I wanted to push for more answers, but something in his tone told me not to bother. I'd learned that Kenneth shared information on his terms, never mine. That set the pattern for the months that followed. The woman in white returned twice more. The first time was about 3 weeks after I saw the lights. I was at my desk when I heard the now familiar footsteps on the porch. My stomach dropped as I remembered her face from that first night. Pale, expressionless, wrong somehow. I stayed at my desk, not moving toward the window. 3 knocks came, evenly spaced, just like before. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing happened for several minutes, and when I finally checked, the porch was empty. The second visit came a month later. Same pattern, footsteps, 3 knocks, then nothing. I followed the rules and stayed away from the door. By now, I understood that looking at her or answering the door would be the last mistake I'd ever make. The fake ranger showed up 3 more times over those months. Each visit followed the same script. He'd walk in without knocking, claim he was making rounds, and I'd bolt out the back door without engaging. I'd call Kenneth, who would arrive to clear the cabin. We never discussed what happened inside during those clearings, and I never asked. The less I knew, the better I slept. On my days off, I started visiting the local library. At first I told myself I was just killing time, but I knew I was looking for answers Kenneth wouldn't give me. The librarian, an older woman named Martha, helped me find archives of local newspapers going back decades. I spent hours scrolling through microfilm, searching for anything about the Park Service or ranger disappearances. It took weeks of digging, but eventually I found what I was looking for. Small articles, usually buried in the middle pages, about park rangers who had vanished while on duty. The first one I found was from 1978. A ranger named Thomas Wilkins had disappeared during a night shift. The article mentioned a search that turned up nothing, and quoted a park official saying they presumed he'd fallen from a ridge in the dark. I found 5 more cases spread across the decades, the most recent from just 6 years ago. A ranger named Melissa Chen had vanished during her overnight shift. Her car was found at her assigned cabin, but she was gone without a trace. The article mentioned she'd only been on the job for 4 months. All of them had been assigned to my section of the mountains. All of them had been working night shifts. None were ever found. I printed copies of the articles and brought them to my next shift. When Kenneth came by to check on me, something he'd started doing more frequently, I laid them out on the desk. "I need to know," I said. "What happened to them?" Kenneth looked at the articles for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he looked up at me, his eyes tired but clear. "They didn't follow the rules." He said nothing more, just gathered the articles and handed them back to me. The message was clear: follow the rules or join the missing. I took the articles back, understanding now why Kenneth had been so insistent that first day. The rules weren't arbitrary, they weren't hazing, they were survival. I'd been at the Eastern Ridge cabin for 4 months now. The routine had settled into my bones. Lock up at 9, check the phone every 30 minutes, ignore strange noises, and never answer when the woman in white knocked. I'd gotten used to the drill, even if I hadn't gotten used to the fear. That night started like any other. I locked all the doors and windows as soon as my shift began, made coffee, and sat at the desk with the logbook open in front of me. The forest outside was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Normal night sounds that I'd learned to distinguish from the other kind. At 11:45, I finished another phone check, marking it in the log with a neat check mark. The coffee had gone cold beside me, but I didn't bother making more. 4 more hours until my shift ended. I'd make it through like I always did. The footsteps came at 12:17. I froze, pen hovering above the logbook. The sound was unmistakable. Soft footfalls on the wooden porch, moving slowly toward the door. I'd heard them before. 3 times now, the woman in white had appeared, knocked 3 times, and disappeared when I followed the rules. I waited, muscles tight, for the familiar 3 knocks. Knock, 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 knock. My blood went cold. 4 knocks, not 3. I grabbed my cell phone with shaking hands and called Kenneth. He answered on the first ring like he always did. "Kenneth, she's back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The woman in white, but she knocked 4 times, not 3. A long pause on the other end. When Kenneth spoke, his voice was tighter than I'd ever heard it. "Blake, listen carefully. Go to the storage room at the back of the cabin. Lock yourself inside. Do not come out until I call the cabin phone. Do you understand?" "What's happening? Why? Now, Blake, move now." The line went dead. I jumped up from the desk, knocking my chair over backward. It clattered against the floor as I rushed toward the back of the cabin. The storage room was small, mostly filled with cleaning supplies and extra equipment. It had a solid door with a deadbolt. I'd never paid much attention to it before. As I moved through the cabin, something scraped against the front window. A sound like fingernails on glass, but harder, sharper. I ran faster. I slammed the storage room door behind me and threw the deadbolt. The room was dark and cramped, barely 6 feet square. I fumbled for the light switch, found it, flicked it on. The bare bulb cast harsh shadows across the shelves of supplies. From the front of the cabin came a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing that belonged in these woods. I backed away from the door until I hit the rear wall, then slid down to sit on the floor. My phone was clutched in my hand, but I knew Kenneth wouldn't answer if I called again. He was coming. I had to wait. The growl became a shriek, high-pitched and piercing. Then came the first impact against the front door. The whole cabin shook. Dust rained down from the ceiling of the storage room. Another impact, harder, the sound of wood splintering. A third hit, and I heard one of the windows crack. Whatever was out there was trying to get in, and the cabin wouldn't hold it for long. I pulled my knees to my chest and tried to control my breathing. The rules had kept me safe so far. Kenneth had kept me safe. I just had to wait. The assault on the cabin continued. Crashes, bangs, the sound of claws. They had to be claws, raking across the exterior walls. The thing moved around the perimeter, testing every entrance. When it reached the back wall, just inches from where I sat, I could hear its breathing. Wet, heavy pants punctuated by those inhuman growls. It scratched at the wall right behind my head. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, forcing myself not to make a sound. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The thing circled the cabin again and again, its attacks growing more frenzied. The walls creaked under the assault. Glass shattered somewhere in the main room. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I strained to hear any movement, any indication of where the creature had gone. Nothing. I don't know how long I sat there in that storage room, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. My legs had gone numb, and my back ached from pressing against the wall. But I didn't dare leave. Kenneth had said to wait for his call, and that's what I would do. When the cabin phone finally rang, its shrill tone cut through the silence like a knife. I wanted to rush out and answer it, but fear kept me frozen in place for several more rings. Finally, I forced myself to stand on shaky legs, unlock the storage room door, and peek out. The main room was a mess. Papers scattered across the floor, my chair overturned. One window completely shattered with glass everywhere. But nothing moved. Nothing waited in the shadows. I crept to the kitchen and picked up the phone on its 6th ring. "Hello?" My voice cracked. "It's over," Kenneth said. "You can come out now." "What was that thing?" I asked, my words tumbling out. "Kenneth, what the hell was that?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, ignoring my question. "Stay inside. It's safe now, but stay inside." He hung up before I could ask anything else. I put the phone down and looked around the cabin. Besides the broken window and scattered papers, nothing seemed too damaged inside. I picked up my chair, straightened the desk, and tried to calm my racing heart. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I grabbed my flashlight and approached the broken window cautiously. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the porch and the trees beyond. Nothing moved out there. Whatever had attacked the cabin was gone. I shined the light along the exterior wall and froze. Deep gouges ran from the ground up to the window frame, 4 parallel lines carved into the wooden siding. I moved to the front door and opened it just enough to shine my light outside. The porch was covered with similar marks, deep scratches in the wood, far too large for any animal I knew. Some were 8 inches long and cut nearly an inch deep into the solid timber. No bear could do that. Nothing in these mountains could do that. I closed and locked the door, then methodically checked every window and exterior wall I could see from inside. Each bore the same marks, massive claw gouges that spoke of something with inhuman strength. Kenneth arrived exactly 20 minutes after his call. When I opened the door to let him in, he looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale in the cabin light. "Are you hurt?" he asked, scanning me from head to toe. I shook my head. "No, I stayed in the storage room like you said." He nodded once, then walked through the cabin, examining the damage. When he reached the broken window, he traced the edge of the frame with his fingertips, his expression grim. "What was it?" I asked again. Kenneth turned to face me. something that doesn't belong here. Something that's been trying to get in for a long time. The woman in white? No, he said. She's different. A warning, maybe. When she knocks 3 times, she's testing the boundaries. 4 knocks means something else found a way to follow her. I sank into my chair, trying to process what he was telling me. Those claw marks, they're not from any animal I've ever seen. No, Kenneth agreed. They're not. He didn't offer any more explanation, and I was too drained to push. We spent the next hour boarding up the broken window and cleaning the worst of the mess. Kenneth made calls to arrange for repairs the next day. Neither of us mentioned what had made those marks or why it had attacked the cabin. As dawn approached and my shift neared its end, Kenneth finally broke the silence. You can request a transfer, you know. After tonight, no one would blame you. I looked at him, surprised. Is that what the others did before they disappeared? His expression hardened. The others didn't follow the rules. But I did, I said. Kenneth nodded. Yes, you did. I thought about it as I watched the first gray light of morning touch the trees outside. I could leave, go back to a normal ranger position somewhere else. Somewhere without women in white or fake rangers or things that clawed at cabin walls in the middle of the night. But something kept me here. The excellent pay, sure. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a factor. But it was more than that. In 4 months, I'd become something I never expected to be. A guardian of sorts. Not just of the park, but of whatever line existed between our world and whatever lay beyond it. The rules were my weapons in a war I didn't understand, but one I was now part of. I'll stay, I told Kenneth. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded again. Your shift's over. Go get some rest. I'll have the cabin fixed before you come back tonight. As I drove down the mountain toward town, exhaustion finally caught up with me. My hands shook on the steering wheel as the adrenaline wore off, but beneath the fear and fatigue, I felt something else, a strange sense of purpose. This cursed place had become mine to protect, and as long as I followed the rules, I would survive to guard it another night. I finally saw what Kenneth actually did during a call. This happened in my 6th month at the cabin, right when winter was starting to loosen its grip on the mountains. The nights were still cold, but you could feel spring trying to push through. I was at my desk around 1 in the morning, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm while updating the logbook. Nothing unusual had happened all night. Phone checks normal, no lights in the forest, no woman in white. I remember thinking it might be one of those rare, completely quiet shifts. Then the front door creaked open. The fake ranger walked in wearing the standard Park Service uniform. His hat was pulled low like always, casting shadows across his face. I never got a good look at his features, which seemed to blur and shift whenever I tried to focus on them. Just making my rounds, he said in that flat voice that never sounded quite human. I didn't answer. I grabbed my keys and phone, then bolted for the back door. I heard him call after me, his voice changing from that pleasant tone to something sharp and angry. I didn't look back. I yanked open the back door, stepped outside, and locked it behind me. The night air hit me like a slap, cold enough that my breath fogged in front of my face. I backed away from the cabin, phone already in my hand, Kenneth's number on screen. But instead of heading straight to my truck like I usually did, something made me pause. Maybe it was curiosity after months of running away, or maybe I was just tired of not knowing what happened after I left. Whatever the reason, I ducked behind my truck, crouching low enough that I could see the cabin but wouldn't be easily spotted. I called Kenneth. He answered on the first ring. Blake? The ranger's back, I said, keeping my voice low. I'm outside, but I'm going to watch this time. There was a pause on the other end. Stay out of sight. I'm on my way. The call ended. I tucked my phone into my pocket and settled in to wait, my eyes fixed on the cabin. Through the windows, I could see lights still on inside. Once or twice I caught movement, a shadow passing by the kitchen window, too tall and too fluid to be human. Kenneth's SUV pulled up about 15 minutes later, its headlights cutting through the darkness before he killed the engine. He got out quickly, and I noticed right away that something was different. Instead of just his service pistol, Kenneth was carrying what looked like an old rifle. I squinted, trying to make out details in the dim light. The rifle had a wooden stock with strange markings carved into it. Symbols I didn't recognize that seemed to curve and spiral along the wood. They caught what little moonlight filtered through the trees, almost like they were glowing faintly. Kenneth approached the cabin cautiously, the rifle held ready but pointed down. He paused at the front door, took a deep breath, then pushed it open and disappeared inside. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard a crash from inside, something heavy hitting the floor. A shout followed, but it wasn't Kenneth's voice. It was higher, with a strange echoing quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. More crashes came, along with the sound of furniture breaking. Something hit one of the windows hard enough to crack the glass. I heard Kenneth yell something I couldn't make out, his voice commanding and firm. Then came a sound I still can't properly describe, like a scream but twisted somehow, starting human but ending in something that reminded me of metal grinding against metal. It rose to a pitch that hurt my ears, then cut off suddenly. Silence fell. I waited, heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give away my position. Minutes ticked by, 5, then 10. I stayed frozen behind my truck, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. The cabin remained still and quiet. Finally, the front door opened. Kenneth stepped out alone. Even from a distance, I could see how exhausted he looked. His shoulders sagged and he leaned on the rifle like it was a walking stick. There was a cut above his eye that hadn't been there before, a thin line of blood trailing down his temple. I stood up slowly, stepping out from behind my truck. Kenneth spotted me and straightened, some of the weariness leaving his posture. "Is it over?" I asked as I walked toward him. Kenneth nodded grimly. "For tonight." Those two words hit me harder than any of the strange sounds I'd heard from inside. For tonight. Not forever. Not completely. Just for tonight. "What was that thing?" I asked, looking past him to the cabin. From outside, it looked normal. No broken windows, no damage visible from where I stood. Kenneth wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve. "Something that doesn't belong here." He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "You weren't supposed to stay and watch." "I know," I admitted, "but I've been running from that thing for months without knowing what happens after I leave. I needed to see." He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "You followed the first part of the rule. You got out. That's what matters." I looked at the rifle in his hand. Up close, I could see the symbols more clearly. They weren't just carved into the wood. They were inlaid with some kind of metal that caught the moonlight. The barrel looked older than any firearm I'd ever seen, almost handcrafted. "What is that?" I asked, nodding toward it. Kenneth glanced down at the rifle, then back at me. Something passed down, something that works. He didn't offer more, and I knew better than to push. But standing there in the cold night air, watching Kenneth catch his breath after whatever battle he'd just fought inside my cabin, I understood something fundamental had changed in how I viewed my job. The rules weren't just guidelines to keep me safe. They were weapons in some kind of war, a war Kenneth had been fighting long before I arrived and would continue fighting long after I was gone. The woman in white, the fake ranger, the lights in the forest, the screaming on the phone line. They were all part of something bigger, something older, something Kenneth faced night after night. "Get some rest," Kenneth said, breaking into my thoughts. "I'll stay and make sure it doesn't come back tonight." I nodded and headed to my truck. As I drove down the mountain toward town, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen and heard, about Kenneth fighting something inhuman in a lonely cabin in the mountains, about how he'd been doing this for years, maybe decades. My first year as a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park came to an end 2 weeks later. In that time, I'd survived dozens of encounters with things that shouldn't exist. I'd seen the woman in white knock on my door 6 times. I'd fled from the fake ranger 4 times. I'd heard screaming through the phone line on 3 separate occasions. I'd watched strange lights dance through the forest twice, and I'd lived through it all because I followed the rules. 6 simple rules that kept me alive in a place where others had vanished without a trace. Sometimes, when I drove up the mountain for my shift, I thought about quitting, about walking into Kenneth's office and handing in my resignation, about finding a normal job where the only thing I had to worry about was meeting deadlines or dealing with difficult customers. But then I'd remember Kenneth emerging from the cabin that night, exhausted but still standing, still fighting, and I knew I couldn't leave. Whatever was happening in these mountains, whatever war was being waged in the darkness, I was part of it now. The rules had kept me alive for a year. They'd keep me alive for another as long as I followed them to the letter, as long as I remembered what happened to those who didn't. I stared at the contract on my desk. the renewal form for my position as Eastern Ridge Night Ranger. The signature line waited for me, empty and patient. Outside the cabin window, the forest stood dark and still, but I knew better now. After a year in this post, I understood the darkness wasn't empty at all. The woman in white had visited again just last week. 3 knocks, right on schedule. I'd stayed at my desk, following Rule 3 without hesitation. The fake ranger had appeared twice in the past month. Each time I'd fled through the back door and called Kenneth immediately. The screaming phone line had become almost routine. Pick up the receiver, hear the distant wails, set it down without hanging up, call Kenneth, wait for the screams to fade. And the forest lights, those eerie blue-white orbs dancing between the trees, had shown up just often enough to remind me they were still out there. Kenneth had been my constant through it all. No matter what horror showed up at my cabin, he answered on the first ring. Sometimes he'd arrive with that strange carved rifle, sometimes just his service pistol. He never explained much, but he always knew exactly what to do. I took a sip of coffee and ran my finger over the contract paper. When I first arrived at this park, I thought I was just watching for forest fires, helping lost hikers, and keeping an eye out for poachers. Now I understood the truth. This wasn't just a ranger station. It was a watchtower, a guard post. And I wasn't just monitoring the park. I was standing between whatever lurked in these mountains and the unsuspecting world beyond. The rules Kenneth had given me that first day weren't some weird hazing ritual or the paranoid instructions of an old-timer. They were weapons. The only weapons I had against things that shouldn't exist. Stay inside from 9 to 6. Ignore unexplained noises. Don't answer when the woman in white knocks 3 times. Exit through the back door if an unknown ranger enters. Check the phone line every 30 minutes. Report lights in the forest after midnight. 6 simple rules that had kept me alive for a year. I thought about the articles I'd found at the library. Thomas Wilkins, Melissa Chen, and 4 other rangers who had vanished without a trace from this very section of mountains. All of them on night shifts, all of them gone without explanation. They didn't follow the rules, Kenneth had said when I showed him the articles. His face had been grim, his eyes distant with memories I couldn't begin to imagine. I picked up my pen, twirling it between my fingers. The night Kenneth had come to deal with the fake ranger, I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see. I'd watched from behind my truck as he entered the cabin with that strange rifle, heard the inhuman scream that started human but ended like metal grinding against metal. I'd seen Kenneth emerge with blood on his face and exhaustion in his eyes. That night changed everything for me. It wasn't just about following rules to stay safe anymore. It was about understanding that Kenneth had been fighting this war long before I arrived and would continue fighting it long after I was gone, unless I stayed. The forest outside my window seemed to hold its breath. The darkness pressed against the glass, watching, waiting. I knew what was out there now, or at least I knew enough to be afraid. But fear wasn't what I felt as I looked down at the contract. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something that truly mattered. Not just a job, not just a paycheck. This was a calling. This was purpose. I signed my name on the line without hesitation. Blake Wheeler, Eastern Ridge Night Ranger, for another year. As long as I followed the rules and trusted Kenneth, I would survive whatever these mountains threw at me. The woman in white, the fake ranger, the screaming phones, the dancing lights, they were all part of something bigger, something older than the park itself. I folded the contract and slipped it into the envelope Kenneth had provided. Tomorrow morning, I'd hand it to him at the main station. He wouldn't say much. He never did. But I'd see the relief in his eyes. One more year with someone who understood the rules. One more year with someone who would follow them. I wasn't just a park ranger anymore. I was a guardian against whatever ancient evils lurked in these mountains. And as I looked out at the darkness beyond my cabin window, I felt ready for whatever came next.